Yesterday, I did a video on my thesis. I watched it and I did not like it. So this is a do-over. Hopefully this one will go a little bit better. Essentially, a few of my friends asked me to do a full-on overview of the thesis, where I mapped the neural oscillation EEG, aka brainwaves, of information science or information seeking. And I'm going to need to try to communicate a little bit better in terms of making sure that whatever I have to communicate scientifically, that it comes out sort of in a way that it's digestible as well as interesting. So this is my attempt to do that. Eagle eye view, for those of you who are not interested in hearing about the details, maybe the first 5 minutes, I'll just go over the eagle eye view, and then I'll share a deck with you. If you're interested in the details, you can stick around. So basically, first of all, just to give you a bit of a context, the field of information science as well as neuroscience totally fascinate me. My first fascination about both of these disciplines is that they're trying to answer questions that, as innately as human beings, we've always had, and probably we will have forever to come. For example, when it comes to information science, one thing that really fascinates me is the fact that information is so extremely influential, important. For example, just take the fact that wherever you were born or whoever you were born with has definitely shaped the person you are today. And that is mainly because the information that you were exposed to from wherever you were born, and your parents, etc. But if there were other information that you were exposed to, you would probably be a bit different person today. Not a bit, probably a lot. And that's one thing. Another thing is the fact that information is so powerful that it sort of shapes the society as well as humanity as a whole, because it really affects our emotional being, our decision making, and so much more. But more specifically, what I'm very interested in is that we are so influenced by information or knowledge, if you will, or data, however you want to call it. However, in actuality, we really don't know what it is and how we can define it. And I have asked many scientists, as well as done my own research. And the fact still remains as to how do we define information. And my question mainly is that at a cellular level or neuron level, what is information? How can we even define it? How do we define it? And what does that even mean? The fact that we say that we know how the brain works, and we also have something called memory where information is saved, we're still not sure where this memory is. We have made some claims, but we're still in the process of proving those. And so it really begs the question, even the fact that we don't know, we can fully define it. It's just very interesting to me. Same with neuroscience. There's many areas within the brain that we're still exploring, and that's great, because as humans, our job is to explore and define and evolve. But when it comes to neuroscience, we have more so than ever focused on the physical brain, for example, what the neurons are, neurotransmitters, hormones, etc., the chemistry of it, sort of the things that we can see and touch to some extent. But the body of knowledge includes much less when it comes to the invisible part of the brain, in this case, the electromagnetic EMF, electromagnetic field, or EEG, aka brainwaves. In scientific journals, we call it neural oscillations, but they're all the same. Essentially, it's the waves in which this communication happened. And even then, we can't really define what that is. But if you think about it, I always think about it, information is communicated via waves. So for example, right now, whatever you're seeing or hearing is via waves, and it's miraculously gets translated into binary languages, computer languages, and then it transfers to you. Anyways, without going into the rabbit hole, which my mind tends to go when I'm by myself and I'm thinking about things, that's the main context and the reason I focused my PhD in neuroinformation science. So it's a mashup of neuroscience and information science, but the neuroscience part is actually the EEG part. It's the invisible brain. I have not focused on the physical brain. So for example, when you want to study the physical brain, you use, for example, neuroimaging machines such as fMRI, functional fMRI, functional MRI. And basically what it does is that you look at the changes in oxygen as well as blood circulations in the brain. And that's when you can see where the brain is lit up. I was a research assistant at Stanford University where I worked with the fMRI machine, but I worked only on the data, conducted regression model, etc., and just was the assistant to the professor. In order to do the fMRI machines, you have to have very extend a lot of certification and things like that, and it's just not like you can't just go into an fMRI studio or a lab and start conducting research. And so then what I could basically practically the type of lab that I could practically create was more or less EEG and using the commercialized EEG neuro headsets. In my case, I use emotive Epoch neuro headset, which is one of the most established one in the industry when it comes to EEG. But I didn't do it just because, that's what I could afford. Of course, that was a big part of it, but also I did it because I'm genuinely interested in brainwaves. Anything with waves, quantum biology, I'm very interested in that. I think that that's really the future of the science. And so essentially, for the dissertation, the mashup of neuroscience and information science, basically I looked at what is the way in which we seek information and acquire information. From the moment you think about, you want to know something, let's say you're curious about something, you take some actions, and then you do some search and seeking for that information, whatever you're looking for. And it could be anything, by the way. It could be gossip, it could be the scientific paper you're interested in, it could be about space, whatever information, really doesn't matter. It's a vast space when it comes to information. So then the paper was positioned in that what happens at the EEG level in the brain when we are curious about something, and when we go and look for it and find that information, and finally we actually sort of quench that thirst that we had for information. Because if you think about it, every single person, whether they think they're smart, whether they think they're not smart, whatever the case may be, whoever we are, we're always seeking some type of information. Some of us seek gossip, some of us seek scientific papers. It really doesn't matter. But at a core level, human beings want to know that we ask questions since we were kids. And so that quest is always there. And the purpose of this study was to see what happens at a brain frequency and at the brain waves level in the brain when we are in that state, basically. That's one part. Another part of the study also looked at whether we are in a positive state of being versus negative state of being, whether that differed in terms of the brain waves when we looked for information. So for example, before you even start asking the questions, if you're in a good mood, does your brain wave differ? And if you're in negative mood, does that differ? just to keep this presentation short, I'm just going to go through the neutral one where I've mapped the EEG of the information search process model. So that's the gist of it. Let me now share my screen with you, and then I'm going to go through the deck that I have done. And I've made this deck a little bit colorful because when you defend your thesis, it usually looks very boring and, you know, it's not very it's not very interesting, I guess, to look at, but that's because you're doing your defense. But this one, I tried to make it a little bit colorful, so bear with me. So essentially the neural oscillations or EEG or brainwaves or brain frequency, however you want to call it, of information seeking when we are in that state. So essentially the main question I had is what type of brainwaves do we emanate when we seek information or knowledge, when we seek data, knowledge, information, and do they change if we are in a positive versus negative seeking mode before we even go about and do it. This is just to establish a little bit of a rapport with you about my background. I have cognitive psychology background as well as neuroscience background, a little bit of computer science background, human-computer interaction background. My thesis is positioned in neuroinformation science. In the industry, I work as UX researcher. I also got a little bit familiar with the information search process model. And future looking, I'm very interested in AGI ASI, which is the next generation of AIs, as well as robotics, and how we can potentially incorporate these type of research that I'm doing in that. I'm also, by the way, very interested in obviously deep learning and EEG because that is part of computational neuroscience that I'm exploring right now. I'm not an expert in it at all. I'm just exploring the postdoc opportunities or for myself, basically independently. I'm doing, by the way, everything I'm doing here, it's all independent. I've never had a funding from any institutions. And so you can definitely rest assured that whatever you see today has not been impacted by any third party. There is no second agenda or third agenda in this. So eagle eye view of the research question that I basically have talked about, essentially what happens in brainwaves activities, in this case, alpha, beta, gamma, when we seek for information. The reason I chose alpha, beta, gamma is because from lit review, we know that these are the three main brainwaves or neural oscillations that an adult that is awake emanates. So that's basically the reason. There are other brainwaves activities, but we didn't focus on that because when you have people in the lab, most probably they never emanate theta, for example, because that's very low frequency. And then a little bit of an introduction, basically, when it comes to information science, and I can jump into the lit review as well. Actually, let me jump into lit review right away, is that when you look at anything in the literature, when it comes to body of knowledge, when it comes to information science, they all start way back when with system-oriented approach, where basically the humans are not there. They're just talking about information retrieval left and right. When you read those papers, a lot of them may be like 20, 30 years old. And it's very interesting that then they start to evolve to include users in there as well. And it's very interesting because whenever you have something that it has to do with information retrieval, you need to have a human in there, because otherwise it's only system-based information retrieval, which is the different computer programmings are doing the information retrieval, the information seeking, no users doing it. But then that evolved into including humans in there as well. Thank you very much, which then evolved to include human emotions in there as well, because then more and more, after a lot of more research in the field, we started realizing that when you have humans, you have emotions as well. In fact, we are not the logical human beings that we thought we were. We're actually very emotional. Most of, if not all of our decision makings are actually based on emotions. And that's very, very easily proven. So if people say, no, I'm not emotional, very easily we can debunk that. It doesn't matter your age, your cultural background, anything like that. We can very easily debunk that theory actually, because we are very emotional. And then the new era of neuro-oriented approach, where I position it myself in that there's not much research in it at the moment. And I called it neuro-oriented. I'm sure other people call it everything else, other areas as well. But the only reason I called it is because I wanted to follow the same sort of pattern in terms of different approaches. And then as a result, this is a eagle eye view concept map of where this study, where this thesis could potentially map, which is a mashup of information science, neural networks, AI and robotics, neuroscience, and affective computing. And before we start actually looking at it, I wanted to also introduce you to the information search process model. This is one of the key theoretical framework that I established my thesis in. And you may ask why, and here's why. Essentially, when you do your thesis, you can't just write a research proposal and say, hey, I just want to look and see what happens in people's brain when they look for information. You need to establish your proposal as well as your thesis with some sort of a framework in the industry. Otherwise, they won't even read your proposal. Basically, it's going to get rejected right away. So you have to do that. And when I started this program, I actually had no background in information science. So I wasn't even aware of this model. But when I talked to the people who interviewed me for the program, which by the way, more or less sort of fell on my lap, was that I basically talked about the question that I had. I'm like, I know that innately we're looking for information as human beings, and we're very curious about pretty much everything. But I want to see what happens at the EEG level. And then I was introduced with this framework, theoretical framework, that is called information search process model. This was developed by Dr. Carol Kulthau. She basically, if I understand correctly, spent over a span of 20 years researching and established a 6-stage of when a human being goes through this information search or seeking process. And it starts with, for example, when a person becomes curious and they start thinking about finding that information, etc., until at the end where they actually have found that information, and then they develop additional questions, etc. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all that. I just want to make you focus on these 3 stages that this thesis that I'm going to be sharing with you focused on: exploration stage, formulation stage, and collection stage. You may ask, why did you focus on the 3 stages and not all 6 stages? The main reason is because upon me reading and educating myself about information search process model, I realized that if I'm going to do this in the lab, it's only these 3 stages that I'm able to mimic in the lab, such that I could collect the EEG of the participants, of the subjects. So these things happen sort of before and after the action of looking for information, and it's not doable in the lab because you can't put those big neural headsets on people's head and control what they're doing, etc., on a daily basis. So in a lab, when you're doing studies, especially a thesis at this level, you have to be controlling for all different variables, otherwise they will reject your thesis. So you have to be very adamant about that. And then these 3 stages were the only ones that I could actually mimic in the lab. So that's why I focused on that: exploration stage, formulation stage, and collection stage. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through exactly what they mean, but feel free to please look up Dr. Kulthau and read about this model. Perfect. Now, the methodology of this research, the independent variable was the state of being of the participants that I controlled and manipulated through IOPS collection, which is a collection of pictures. And I controlled their state by showing them neutral, pleasant versus unpleasant pictures. So there are 3 levels of state of being, emotional state of being, of independent variables. And these 3 levels, they were established by Lang, and it's very well established in cognitive psychology, by the way. It's called IAPS, very established. And again, whatever you do for a PhD, it has to be established. You can't just pull things out of your head and just say, I'm going to do this. You have to like write, chapters about it. And then the dependent variable, that's the one that I measured. Obviously, one of them was EEG. I also did interviews, and I also did SAM, self-assessment. But for the interest of time, I'm not going to go through it. I'm just going to share with you the neural oscillations, EEG. Again, here, 3 levels, alpha, beta, gamma bands. And then the search task that I had was developed by White, 2004, because you may ask the question, well, how were you able even to establish how the subjects in the lab were in the state of those 3 stages of ISP model that I talked about here. So you need to do something in the lab to put them within these states. Otherwise, you can't measure it. You cannot claim that I had participants do this, and in my opinion, they were in the exploration stage. When you write your thesis, you have to actually make that claim in a scientific way. So you have to prove it. And the way I was able to prove it was the fact that I found White. In 2004, he wrote several papers where he actually conducted several studies, and based on those studies, established specific tasks, search tasks, that he proved / claimed would put subjects into these stages. So this is very important to remember, because that's how basically I put the participants in the lab in these 3 stages by using search task developed by White that was already established and published in journals, etc., to use those tasks to put the participants in that stage. So I had them perform these tasks, and then I, based on the different variety of tasks that he had, then I was able to connect that, okay, they did this task, and then this is the EEG that they emanated, exhibited, and this task based on White correlates, for example, let's say with exploration stage. So that's very important to remember. Another thing that is very important to remember is that when you have several different levels of independent and dependent variables, in order to counterbalance any type of learnability effect, you have to use some statistical established block design to make sure that the subjects are not exposed primarily to maybe one condition over the other. In this case, I ended up using Greco-Latin square experimental block design, because this block design helped me establish a way that you can see here, where I exposed the subjects to different treatments, different level of treatments, and I then, using this block design, had a peace of mind that I basically addressed any issues with learnability, or counterbalance any learnability effects or any bias that the subject may have exhibited if they were exposed more to one level than the other. So this is very, very important too. I ended up doing 2 pilot studies. So this whole thing actually took my collecting the data, doing the design and collecting the data and all that, and the analysis took actually 2 years, but I was working full-time at the same time. So, but I ended up doing 2 distinguished pilot studies. Together, there were 9 participants. I started with 1 pilot study with 3 participants only, And then I established that. I did the analysis, presentation to my advisors and everything. What we learned, then I did a second pilot study that was 6 participants. And then again, ran the studies, ran the data analysis, presented it to my advisors. And then based on that learning, I did a main study. The main study consisted of 48 participants, mainly because for this blockchain block design to be established, I needed to have, a specific amount of participants or subjects. And I could have gone a little bit lower, but I wanted to make sure that this study really had enough participants so that I could actually make some claims, because this thesis was one of its kind, and I didn't want it to be wishy-washy. I didn't want to, I want to make sure that it's very, very well thought through and everything. And also another reason is because, being a woman, you overcompensate, especially when you're in science, because you know that people don't take you seriously. So I kind of overcompensated. I want to make sure that everything is great. And so as a result, it took me many years, 7 years in. So yeah, it definitely took 7 years. See, here is a visual presentation of basically the whole thesis at a data analysis and data visualization level. Start with the ISP model. Here are the typical sort of visualization of the EEG data analysis that I had. For example, this is one participant that shows their scalp with different hertz. For example, this is 8, this is alpha waves, etc. And then I also use continuous emotion model of Russell. I'm not going to go into that because in the interest of time, but I included that in there as well for other reasons. And this is also an eagle eye view map of the different EEG devices or EEG data that I have. So great. Now, let's look at the research finding at an eagle eye view first. So this is basically, if you will, a how do you say, it's a sorry, I just saw, I think it looks a little bit better like this. There we go. Basically, this is a 7 years, result of 7 years, sweat and blood and everything. So it looks simple, but it took a long time to do. Essentially, I just tried to map here Kurosawa's model. I call them discrete emotions because they're more or less discrete emotions, the different stages: exploration stage, formulation stage, as well as collection stage. I added the Russell continuous emotion model where I connected how would this type of emotions, discrete emotions or states, match with a continuous emotion that Russell talks about. Russell is very known, by the way, in cognitive psychology. And then the establishment of the EEG data that I have here. Neutral is when the subjects basically were in a neutral state of being when they started with information seeking. Positive is when they started from the positive point of view and then negative point of view. And so for the interest of time, we're just going to go through the neutral aspect of it. And this is the neutral. And as you can see, the left prefrontal lobe actually showed to be the most active. And I'll talk a little bit about which waves, which bands I actually found them. Here is an eagle eye view of a positive and negative states. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through that. All right, great. So basically, let's go back here. Basically, this is sort of the overall mapping of it. Now, you may ask, okay, this is all great. What's next? So first of all, with this map, this thesis did what it claimed to do. So the idea was to add to the body of knowledge in the field of information science to look at the information search process model at the EEG level, at the neuroscience level. So basically this was established here. And because there were enough participants and there were 2 pilot studies, etc., we felt pretty confident that, this was the result. I do at the end encourage people to replicate this research, because obviously that's how science works. It starts with one area and then people just, continue with it and build on it. So that's hopefully in the future, when neuroscience and information are mashed up more and more, that could happen in the future. So that happened. Having said that, there are other implications that we could potentially also talk about, which I discuss in the final chapter of my thesis. Anyone interested in reading that, by the way, it's almost 200 pages, so it's too much to read. But if you're interested, I'll add the link as well. But a few of the implications is, for example, last week I talked about EEG in deep learning. I interviewed Dr. Albrecht, brilliant researcher. If you're interested, go back and look at it. Brain-computer interface, obviously very interested. Last but not least, I also want to mention the guided inquiry design framework, which is a continuance, in my understanding, of the information search process model, but at a practical level, where in the school or in classrooms, they are using different frameworks to help students, etc. And so in that sense, then one of the things that I explored with is being able to guide the brain waves, the neural oscillations of, for example, the listeners via music, but that could potentially be used, for example, in guided inquiry design framework, because as I'm sure you know, anything that we absorb through our sensory system affects our state of being, but more importantly, it affects our brain. And music is one of them. It's huge. It's omnipresent. There's no direction. It's omnidirectional. And research has shown that it's very impactful on the state of being of people. And so because of that, then I explored ways where we could compose music. In my case, electronic music, meaning to say there are no words in it, because words could also affect the state of being of humans in different ways. But if you only have music, then it's more of a pure way of impacting the neural connections, and as well as brain chemistry, etc. And so, for example, I took different parts of the information search process model, ISP model, different parts of it, and then I extracted the neural oscillation of that, for example, stage in the ISP model, and based on that, I composed electronic music and then tested whether that impacted the neural oscillations of those who listened to that music and how it did it. So for example, in collection stage, Dr. Kuhlthauer's model established that is where the users are in a sense of a direction. They have a confidence, hope, if you will. So it's a positive sort of state of being. Russell's model can be connected to this state of being as positive and excited. Again, a positive state of being. And then the EEG of this collection stage was then established by this thesis to be both alpha and beta bands within the left frontal lobe. And in existing body of knowledge, also left frontal lobe is more or less connected with positive emotions. So that was a very exciting finding of this. And so based on that, for example, I composed, I think 7 tracks total. This one is called purpose.mp3. And I'll link the video where I have a sample on YouTube as well. And after that, when I composed it, obviously I composed it with my neural headset, but then I had subjects listen to it. And then we, gathered some data from there as well. And in fact, it made them feel these emotions and be in these states of sense of direction and all that. So basically, one of the things that I propose from the practical implication of this study is that we can easily use music to put users, students, people, doesn't matter who, in those state of being, but it's more of an intentional hearing, intentional listening to music, as opposed to just listening to any music. Obviously, I'm not a composer. These are just like experiments. But if you're more than welcome to listen to it and tell me. I would love to hear how it changed, or if it changed your state of being. And then anyone interested to replicate this research, my whole almost 200-page thesis is on Queensland University of Technology website. It actually ended up winning the award of Outstanding Thesis of 2019, which I think only 5% of students win every year. So that was a very prestigious, and honestly, I didn't even know that I was nominated. They just sort of told me, and I almost fell off my chair when I heard it. So definitely huge, huge honor. I don't think I deserve it, but it's a huge honor anyway. Thank you so much to all my advisors, and also to people who nominated me, and to my school. Thank you, all that. And then last but not least, I ended up writing a guidebook that is on Amazon, both a Kindle version as well as paperback version, because I used the emotive neural headset, EPOC neural headset. Essentially, I built my lab under $1,000. And then I also used the open source EEG lab software with a compiled with MATLAB. That was EEG lab and MATLAB, that was for free. So while it was free, and it gave me the opportunity to actually run such a study at such level, I bumped into a lot of challenges, compatibility challenges. It was blood and sweat, and I lost a lot of hair, and it was just horrible. And back then, I remember that wishing that such guidebook existed, and it didn't. So I ended up reading a lot of forums and having a lot of conversation with other students, etc. And so once I graduated, after a year that I had to recuperate a little bit, I wrote this book with that purpose in mind. So for anybody who wants to use emotive EPOC neural headset series as hardware and EEG lab MATLAB as software, and you're bumping into problem, this is your book, because this will give you really help with even setting up both the hardware as well as the software. It also shows you step by step how to set it up, because there's a lot of challenges with setting it up and even collecting data. It also shows you step by step how to visualize those data. How to interpret it exactly, you do need to have a little bit of a neuroscience background. So that's sort of outside of the realm of this book. But if you're beginner and you just want to start with those two, software and hardware that I mentioned, you can definitely use this book. I'll also add a link below. Lastly, if you want to find me on social media, I'm trying to learn to communicate science a little bit better. I think it's very important that more and more scientists come to social media to talk about it, because I think that social media is overwhelmed with people who are either repeating other people's science, and a lot of times, if not all of the time, they're actually misrepresenting it. Or also they're just straight out lies, or they just do things to, I don't know, do clickbait or God knows what, why. So I'm sort of taking this initiative to, while I'm in the lab and doing my studies, to also come out and communicate it, and sort of, facilitate those type of thinking and thought processes in terms of what do these all mean? And if you've ever listened to any scientific talks, you know that it's very typical of scientists to, first of all, not claim anything, because they know the more you know, the more you realize how stupid you are. So unlike these marketing people out there who talk about brain, etc., who claim that they know everything, when you listen to scientists, you will notice that it's the humility is there. And then, yeah, secondly, I encourage you to find more scientists on social media if you want. I'll also talk about the Neuromatch Academy next, because I'm setting up a funding to fund some underprivileged female students to get into computational neuroscience, but I'll talk more about it later. All right, let me actually stop sharing. So there, hi. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you find this helpful. And if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.